Hello. Welcome back to the Paperback Warrior podcast. I'm your co-host, Eric. While you've been gone, we've been right here flipping pages on vintage paperbacks and, I guess, men's action adventure as well. We're really having a blast doing this thing. As always, thanks for listening to the show and for your support. Remember to subscribe to whatever podcast service that you're using. You can find us everywhere. Last week, we had a really cool discussion on Gold Eagle's The Executioner Saga, and that sort of incorporated all things Mac Bolan. As you've seen in the episode title, today we're going to work a little bit laterally and talk about the great Peter McCurtin. Peter McCurtin.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk to Tom here. I'm going to bring him on and let him tell us what's going on for today.
All right, so as Eric mentioned, we're going to be doing a feature on Peter McCurtin, and I'll tell you why he matters. And we have two reviews for today's show. One is called Duel in the Snow by a German author by the name of Hans Meissner. And then we are also going to talk about a French action novel, Malko No. 1, West of Jerusalem, by Gerard De Villiers. Now, Eric does not speak German. I do not speak French, so both of these books are available in the English tongue. But first, Eric, before we get into all that, you've been doing some shopping.
Yeah, sure have. And I'm going to start by saying Malko sounds like a dirty word for some reason. I don't like saying Malko.
Well, stay tuned.
All right. So, I went to our old stomping grounds in DeLand, Florida, which is, about an hour south of Paperback Warrior HQ. It's called the Family Bookshop, and they're located in DeLand. Been there for years. DeLand is this little small town, and surprisingly, each time I go in there, it's fairly busy. There's a college there called Stetson, but I can't imagine that the college students are frequenting that bookstore. Tom's really picked the place clean, honestly, in terms of the mystery, the vintage, the crime noir. He's pretty much gutted the place. But there's still a little bit of meat on the bones for westerns and men's action adventure. The western section there is probably the best in the area. It's stacked two deep across two really long aisles. The men's action adventure is absolutely loaded in there, and I'm going to speculate that they've got maybe 3/4 of the whole run of Executioner. Probably the same for Penetrator. They've got a ton of those. Got a lot of titles in the Phoenix Force, Able Team, Death Merchant, SOB series, and so forth. Really stacked. I don't know. This visit, I picked up nearly the whole series of Denison's War. This was a really cool mid-'80s Bantam series written by Steven Krauser under the name Adam Lassiter. Krauser wrote a number of Mac Bolan titles as well as co-authoring a Western series called Cord. The books have really catchy covers, and they're really unique because when you open up the first page, it's this gatefold, beautifully painted cover that ties into the book story, sort of like the old men's action adventure magazines. Real pretty gatefold covers. Look for a review of the fourth book, King of the Mountain, which I just finished up. I also scored a copy of a Fawcett Gold Medal book called The Last Safari. This was originally titled Gilligan's Last Elephant, and it was written by a British novelist named Gerald Hanley. The book was adapted for cinema in 1967 under famed director Henry Hathaway. Some of you might remember him. He did a lot of westerns, directed John Wayne, Randolph Scott. And I found The Last Safari in the romance section, oddly enough. I guess Tom just didn't bother to search there. And the last thing I found was an ace novel called Appalachian Gold by a popular mid-century author named Frank G. Slaughter. We might cover Frank Slaughter in a later episode of the podcast, but he was a novelist and a physician who attended medical school at Johns Hopkins. He specialized in medical thrillers and biblical-inspired stories, but he had a hand in a few adventures, and a lot of them were set right here in Florida. Tom, here's a little neat tidbit about Frank Slaughter. You ready for this?
Lay it on me.
So he was a surgeon right here in Jacksonville at Riverside Hospital.
He's a homeboy.
He is, and I guess that's why a lot of his books are set in Florida.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so he was over here in Jacksonville in the mid-century, and the rest of his contemporaries were over in the Gulf Coast writing. So anyway, that's my acquisitions.
God, I remember going to a used bookstore in, do you know what that town is near Live Oak out on Route 10? It's about halfway between here and Tallahassee. It's where, oh man. This is going to be fascinating for our listeners to hear a geography. It's where I-75 and Route 10 come together. I can't think of the name of the town. Anyway, there's a used bookstore there. Just went out of business about a month ago, and I bought a ton of Frank Slaughter books because they look like war novels, and every single one of them was some weird nursing romance in World War II, and I ended up just getting rid of them all for a bunch of credit at Chamblin's bookstore, a much better bookstore. So if you can find a Frank Slaughter book that's truly exciting, I'm interested in hearing about it because I am a Frank Slaughter skeptic. With a name like Slaughter, you have to figure the books are going to be amazing, but they're just not.
It's got to be.
All right. Anyway, so let's move on to the feature, if that's cool with you.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so I want to talk to you about Peter McCurtin, explain who he was and why he matters. Now, Peter McCurtin is a bit of an enigma, and that's because he was an author, but he was also a house name, and other people wrote under the Peter McCurtin name. He was a collaborator, where he would sometimes write the first couple chapters of a book to get it started and provide a book outline to different authors who would write those books. And he was also an editor, where he edited a lot of other people's books. It was so confusing for a while that people didn't even know if there was such a person as Peter McCurtin, but I'm here to assure your listeners, and I'll explain how I know this, that there was a real person named Peter McCurtin. He was born in Ireland in 1929. He actually immigrated to America in the 1950s. During the 1960s, he owned a bookstore up in Maine, and his first published novel was in 1968. Anything Goes is what it was called. It was one of those softcore porn novels that everybody collects right now as sleaze paperbacks. I don't understand the fascination with them because everyone likes the covers. I think the covers look like crap, and the books are just mostly terrible. The authors who wrote those books back in the days are all very embarrassed of their work, but some of them went on to some great things. Anyway, so Anything Goes was his first book for Midwood Books, but his first real book of any significance was called Mafioso. It was a 1970 book. It was one of these mafia books. It was basically a Godfather ripoff, but he did get him a nomination for an Edgar Award. And the cover blurb on the UK edition, I love. It's brutal as an ice pick in the spine. It was the paperback Mafioso. Anyway, and it was such a success, he wrote a bunch of kind of mafia standalone books. Everybody was writing mafia books around 1970 because The Godfather was such a hit. Anyway, so he did a ton of pseudonym work, more than we'll likely ever know about. A kind of writer, collector, and academic by the name of Lynn Monroe did a great job of tracking a lot of them down. The first series that he wrote was a Western series called Carmody, which also began in 1970. He wrote for Leisure Books, and he also served as an editor for Leisure Books. Eventually, he switched over to Belmont Tower, and Belmont Tower may have been related on a corporate level to Leisure Books. Belmont's kind of corporate history is people know about it. I don't, so don't call or write about how I got it wrong about Belmont Tower. But I'm 100% sure that McCurtin worked for Belmont Tower. And it was kind of a low-end publisher. I see Belmont books all the time. And he was smart enough to know that it took that alluring covers made it, but sometimes the books inside did not stand up to it. He did a novelization for the Exterminator movie. You've seen that. You've seen the famous cover of that. It's got like a guy in a motorcycle helmet with a flamethrower. I think that was also the movie poster. The Sundance series of westerns was, I think, the first few were by the same author of Fargo, but he took over that series in 1979. Also in the western genre, he wrote the Jim Sadler series of adult westerns, where the hero gets laid a lot, that were written under the name Gene Curry. He also wrote some of the Lassiter westerns. I guess Len Levinson said he looked like Winston Churchill. He was a hardcore alcoholic, and again, I'm not looking to disparage the guy or anything like that, but everyone kind of agreed that. He lived in a small Manhattan walk-up. He died in 1997 at age 68. By the time he died, he was estranged from his children, who refused to talk about him when people reach out to try to get some history about him. Nobody preserved his papers or notes for future academics or people like us who may care about this. His writing, I think, is very no frills. I like his writing, actually. It's very, very straightforward. A lot of people wrote books under McCurtin's name, including Ralph Hayes, Paul Hofrichter, George Harmon Smith, and I mentioned Len Levinson. He also, when the Mac Bolan series, Executioner series, kind of took off, he produced a bunch of not counterfeit ones, kind of rip-offs. There were so many of them. One was the Sharpshooter series by under the pseudonym of Bruno Rossi. that was published by Leisure Books. He edited them, and some of them he wrote the outline, some of them he rewrote. It's difficult to tell how much his fingerprints on each one. There was the Marksman series. The first two were published under McCurtin's own name, and then they switched to a house name of Frank Scarpetta. It was really basically the same series as the Sharpshooter series. In fact, I think they also have some name mix-ups in it where the character's name in one is referred to as the other. Difficult to tell how many of those McCurtin wrote versus how many he edited versus how many he started writing and handed off to somebody or plot outlines. He did write the Assassin series under his own name, and I've heard decent things about that series. I haven't actually read it, but I have it. Now, he wrote some standalone novels as well, and you had some experience with one of McCurtin's books that you reviewed on the site called Escape from Devil's Island. What'd you think of that one?
Yeah, he wrote Escape from Devil's Island in 1971 for Belmont Tower, as Tom alluded to earlier. That was his publishing house. It was republished in 1974 with artwork that attempts to cash in on the Papillon movie, which was Steve McQueen, and I think that came out in 1973, so it was just a cash-in attempt with the cover. It even says at the top of the book, it says, "In the savage tradition of Papillon!" ! McCurtin's novel and the movie are both based on the real-life Henry Charrier's, I don't speak French, Henry Charrier's time in the French Guiana penal system. The book is set in the late 1930s on the notorious Devil's Island. Captain Beaujeu and Colonel Gamillard, probably butchering these names.
You are.
but he butchered lots of prisoners.
It's Papillon.
Papillon.
Papillon. Is it New Guinea? Is that the word you were trying to say earlier? No, French Guyana.
French Guyana.
All right, okay.
I knew a French Diana once. So this penal colony is ran by these notorious guys, and they chop heads off at the guillotine for fun. And the book's protagonist is a guy named Ginron, who's a former U.S. Marine, and he was sentenced there for sleeping with a guy's wife, and then was accused of killing him. So he's gone to prison. The narrative kind of explores whether he's guilty or innocent, which is kind of keeps you tied to the story. There's a whole backstory, really, of the man's wife and the things that happened up until the point where he got captured. McCurtin's description of prison is done really well. It's it's a hot, sweltering prison camp doing hard labor by the sea, so it's brutal. I like prison stories, and I think this one sets really high on the shelf when it comes to prison stories. The Ginron's attempts at a jailbreak are really the thesis, and I would say that McCurtin writes the best fistfight I've ever read. Ginron fights a devilish captain and a hefty Belgian ex-boxer named Radisson, and they both target Ginron as their next rape victim. Of course, Ginron fights back, and the fistfight lasts 13 pages, which is pretty freaking awesome. It's an easy 150 pages. It's a manageable font size. There's really nothing wrong with it at all. In fact, I'm going to say it's a mandatory read. I think everyone will really enjoy it.
All right, so my favorite McCurtin series is the Soldier of Fortune series. And people were fascinated with the idea of Soldier of Fortunes. There was Soldier of Fortune magazine, which had its own series, different than the McCurtin series in the 1970s. The series stars a guy named Jim Rainey, who is a mercenary for hire, who basically, I think he's a Vietnam veteran, who basically hires himself out to the highest bidder, and it's usually in some hellhole conflict. What's cool about the Jim Rainey books, and every one of them takes place in a different country, Rhodesia, Argentina, Lebanon, Panama, Kenya, Hong Kong, New Guinea, the Caribbean, Afghanistan, Ireland, Philippines, South Africa, etc. There were 9 books written in the 1970s in the series, and then the series went away for like 6 to 8 years, I think, and then 9 books written in the 1980s in the series, all starring the same dude. Some of them were written by McCurtin himself. Some of them were outsourced. Ralph Hayes wrote several of the books. Paul Hofrichter wrote one of the books. And I think there's no indication. Again, he was writing for these low-end publishers, oftentimes who didn't bother to register the copyrights. I believe, from having read a bunch of them, that McCurtin wrote all the ones that weren't known to be Ralph Hayes. In fact, I'm writing an article right now that's probably going to appear a few weeks after this airs on the series and who wrote what and what order they actually came in, because they're not numbered. They're very, very politically incorrect. He's going to these third world nations, many of whom are Africans. He doesn't really treat the African warriors and warlords respectfully. Not that they deserve to be at the time, but the characters are not. They're just not politically correct, and that's fine. There's no problem with that. But if for somehow you have sensitivity to an African warlord not being treated as a prince in fiction, well, that's tough luck for you. And they're incredibly violent. What I like about them, and this is what keeps coming into my mind, that's different, and I know you're not a fan of this, but I like this, first-person narration. It's very rare in the men's adventure genre for a series to be written in first person. And he's got this great conversational style where you feel like you're sitting next to this grizzled guy with scars all over his body in a bar, telling you the story about his time in Rhodesia, shooting up Africans, basically.
Yeah, that is pretty unusual for men's action adventure. You hardly ever see that.
Right. And so that's basically everything I know about Peter McCurtin. And I want to give credit where credit is due. Ben Bridges, a great Western author whose real name is David Whitehead, wrote a fantastic article on one of his websites. It may be his Piccadilly Press website on Peter McCurtin. I mentioned Lynn Monroe. He's done a lot of great work on it, on Peter McCurtin, uncovering who wrote what, and on his website. And the Glorious Trash blog has done some nice work on McCurtin thanks to their connection with Len Levinson, who was actually one of Peter McCurtin's writers. If you check on these various websites, you can find bibliographies of Peter McCurtin. A lot of them are still mysteries, but really I think he's an author worth checking out. And he's probably one of the most important figures in men's action adventure fiction just because of the giant footprint he left as an editor, a house name, and a writer. So that's it. Let me throw it over to you, Eric, because you have a review you want to do, right?
Yeah, definitely. That was really good stuff on McCurtin. Appreciate you doing that, Tom. I'm going to talk about a book called Duel in the Snow, and it was written by a German author named Hans Meissner. The book was originally released in German back in 1964. It was reprinted again in 1972. In 1972, I think both of those were British editions with different covers. And the version that I owned, which is a pyramid pressing, in 1974. Meissner's career, from what I can gather, there's not a lot of information out there about the guy, but he was a diplomat. He worked his whole career in places like London, Moscow, Milan, Tokyo, retired, used his world travel experience and became an author and specialized in really 3 different areas. You can find his work in political history, travelogues, and adventure fiction. One of his travelogues was dedicated to Alaskan hunting and fishing, which are really skill sets that he uses liberally in this particular book. To preface the book's description, we really need to look back at the U.S. and Japan in World War II, specifically 1942. Just 6 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese forces target another U.S. property, which was the island of Attu. The island sits right on the coast of Alaska, and the backstory here is that in 1935, General Billy Mitchell advised U.S. Congress that whoever holds Alaska will hold the world. He felt it was the most important strategic place on the planet. Well, the Japanese felt that way too, so they invaded and occupied Attu, and shockingly, they were unopposed. The U.S. was, I guess, just really busy in Europe and just sort of left that door open. The idea that the Japanese had constructed was to build airstrips on the island that they were going to use to launch aerial attacks on America's West Coast cities. I mean, that's that's a terrifying scenario, right? But the weather conditions there are some of the worst in the world. You've got frigid temperatures, howling winds. It's really a barometric nightmare. So Meissner takes these factual events and occurrences and runs with it as a clever fictional concept. So he has Japanese forces needing to understand the weather patterns to successfully launch their fighters and bombers. To do this, they must piece together a small team of soldiers, which are going to be led by one of 2 main characters in the book, Captain Hidaka. They're going to parachute into the northern region of Alaska and then transmit weather patterns by radio over to the island of Attu. These broadcasts were, of course, going to be intercepted by the U.S., so knowing that, the Japanese are going to be broadcasting on the go. They're constantly going to be on the move. They're never going to camp at one site for too long. And this is really, this is a harrowing adventure. It's exhausting. It's cold. The Japanese soldiers here have very little experience in cold weather. In fact, they have to get trained on how to parachute. And because of this, Hidaka is told that none of his team will be retrieved. They're being dropped into Alaska, and they're not gonna come home. So Hidaka knows this, and he realizes that this is just a do and die mission. I'm not going to spill anything for you on Hidaka's plans after the mission is done, but there are some hints of what he had in mind when the mission comes to an end. The U.S. had already drafted a lot of soldiers out of Alaska, so there's not a lot left, and so they're sort of relying on this National Guard unit, which is referred to as the Alaskan Scouts. These scouts knew the area fairly well, and they can survive in the harsh conditions, but they don't have any combat experience. So remember, the idea is to find these guys and kill them or stop the mission altogether. But without combat experience, it's going to be pretty difficult. So the U.S. military reaches out to the other main character of the book, a guy named McClure, who's going to lead the scouts into the northern region to hunt and kill the Japanese forces. The U.S. and Japanese forces fighting in Alaska during World War II is a really wild idea, and I love that that Meissner came up with the story. Granted, there's only about 20 total combatants altogether, but it still makes for a really cool whirlwind of action. But McClure, he missed the draft due to not having a real physical address on file. I mean, this guy's a game warden in Alaska. He spends most of his life in the wilderness, so he misses the draft. And surprisingly, he doesn't really want to fight at all. He wants to rescue beavers. He wants to fight wolverines. He wants to make sure that the Alaskan interior is in tip-top shape. But the military locates McClure, and they tell him, "Hey, we're going to enlist you. You're going to do the job for the military." And there's not a whole lot he can do about it. So he hesitantly declines, but then gets enlisted and really has to do the assignment. And by the time that the mission rolls around, he really accepts it and does it. So the whole narrative in the middle of the book is just McClure's team hunting Hidaka's team through the snowy mountains of Alaska. There's a lot of realistic look at survival. I'm assuming based on Meissner's own experience. There's a ton of adventure, obviously some action because these two forces, have to meet at some point. I enjoyed the Alaskan history. There's a lot of really detailed looks at the Eskimo and Japanese customs and traditions. And I thought that really made the novel more dynamic and enjoyable from that standpoint. Honestly, Tom, I'm not sure why this novel isn't well known or why we haven't even seen it on the big screen. It would make an awesome movie or show, either one. I'm assuming based on 4 printings, it had to have at least sold pretty well. But anyway, that's my thoughts. I'm recommending it to our listeners. I think that the Western fans will really love the rugged wilderness aspect of it. But I also think military fiction and even nonfiction readers are really going to enjoy it. The World War II history there. But at the end of the day, men's action adventure enthusiasts like myself are absolutely going to adore it. I recommend it, but it's going to be a tough assignment to try to find this book. It goes for about $15 up to, I think there's a copy on Amazon for $80, so it's going to be expensive. It's kind of hard to find, but good luck. It's well worth it.
To be clear, was this book written in German and then translated into English?
It was, yeah, absolutely. It was a German book in 1964 and then translated into English for the 2 English pressings and then the pressing for the Pyramid. And I didn't really see any issues with the language. It seems like it was transcribed really well.
Good, yeah. I often shy away from books when they're translated, just thinking that they're going to be clunky, but this one was smooth, huh?
Very smooth read. And now it's a long read. I don't know if I mentioned that, but it's 250-some-odd pages, 280 pages. So it's not your standard 180-page, action-adventure book or Western.
That's a lot of reading. Your lips must have been tired reading a book that long.
And I will say this. I read it in nearly one sitting because I was so glued to it. And I rearranged my entire day just to avoid any kind of stoppage in the story because it was really so good. My girlfriend wasn't happy with how much time I spent with it, but books matter.
Yeah, in for a dime, in for a dollar when you date one of us. All right, so that was your review of, say the author and title one more time, just so we can make sure people know.
Duel in the Snow by Hans Meissner.
Hans Meissner!
You got it.
All right, much better. All right, since we're touring the EU right now, I want to talk about the Malko series. It's Malko by Gerard De Villiers. You can find a review this week at paperbackwarrior.com. This was an incredibly successful series. In France and maybe even England, it was known as the SAS series. I could explain what that stands for, but it's a long story with not a great payoff. The author, Gerard De Villiers, wrote them all. He died in 2013 after writing 200 installments of this series. And what was interesting is that the stories in the series over the course of all these years were really ripped from the headlines. It was like, for instance, like in the 60s, or I guess it'd be 70s, there was like one of the books was called Killing Kissinger, about somebody who's actually trying to assassinate Henry Kissinger. The books written in the 2000s, he wrote them up until the time he died. Some of them, Vladimir Putin is the guy who's it becomes a character in the books. That's sort of a fun thing of him ripping names from the headlines and making them fictional characters in this books. Anyway, so who is Malko? The other thing to know is that, so there were 200 installments, but only about 20 or so of them were actually ever translated into English. And so Pinnacle released a bunch of them in from the very beginning of the series. And then there was a publisher who's been publishing them online and I think trade paperbacks for some of the last books in the series. So there's probably 180 books in the series in the middle that are still in French and haven't been in there. Near as I can tell, the series order does not matter. You can read them in any order. And they do a very nice job. They were written in French, and the one that I read, book number 1, West of Jerusalem, was translated very smoothly. I would not have known it was a French novel. And one of the reasons you would not know it's a French novel is because it's a CIA story. This is not taking place in some weird French intelligence service you've never heard of. It is a straight-up CIA story where Malko is serving the CIA in the good old U.S. of A. Now, Malko is a guy named Malko Linge, Linge, and the backstory with him is that he's an Austrian prince, like from Austria, who went to Harvard and began doing contract work with the CIA. Malko inherits a castle, his family's castle in Austria, but the castle is so run down, he needs money to renovate it, which is why, so he's got the status, and this is not unusual, he's got the status of royalty because he's an Austrian prince, but he doesn't have the money of royalty. And now he's inherited this big stupid castle that's falling apart. And the way he earns money to do the renovation to get this castle up and running is by taking assignments for the CIA. So it's not entirely clear to me if he's like a CIA employee getting a paycheck every 2 weeks, or if he's like a contractor. But it's always like the big story, the big case that they bring him in on, usually involving some international travel somewhere. His character, he's very much kind of a jet-setting playboy type of character. The numbering of the series is so screwy. The number 1 book in the U.S. is West of Jerusalem, as published by Pinnacle. That was actually the 9th book in France. There was a book, I believe, called Malko versus the CIA, which is some other number in English. I think it was the number 1 book in France. None of that really matters. Anyway, West of Jerusalem was just awesome. I was just so bowled over. I had owned copies of this series before and just traded them away because I'm an ugly American and I thought I didn't want to read a French action novel that was translated. But man, was that a mistake. So I've been trying to get them back into my life, and West of Jerusalem was great. It begins with the suicide of the CIA director in Washington, D.C., and there's an investigation internally at the CIA, and it's clear that the CIA director's suicide was driven by something that he was involved in. And so they bring in Malko to kind of conduct an investigation that ends up going overseas as to why the CIA director, with whom he had a good relationship with, kills himself. And it was really good. I thought, based on the kind of cartoonish, Pinnacle-like cover of the book, that it would be stupid, like a butcher novel or a death merchant book. But man, oh man, this was a smart book. It's a real page turner. It's, big font. It has not been put out electronically, to my knowledge, but it's worth checking out. I believe, I have a theory that the Malko books are going to explode over the course of the next few years, because they just announced that book number 9 in the Pinnacle version, Pinnacle series, Checkpoint Charlie in the Malko series, has been not optioned. I think that Michael Fassbender, the actor, is going to be producing it. I think maybe directing it and starring as Malko in the Checkpoint Charlie movie based on the Malko series. And so I'm hoping it's a hit, only because I want to see the Malko books, all of them, get reprinted and translated into English, because this is a great series and you shouldn't have to overpay for them. So that's pretty much it. You're going to be seeing a review on Paperback Warrior. I'm busy accumulating all the Malko books I can get my hands on, and the one I read is just terrific, and I've heard good things from other people about the other ones.
So, question for you on Malko. Is there any other characters that are mainstays or consistent throughout the series? I mean, like, Mac Bolan has a set of characters. Killmaster has characters. Does this one have any?
I think so. I think there's other CIA guys that he teams up with who keep coming back, but Malko is clearly the star of the book and the star of the series. I suspect that there's some continuity within the books, but I have to tell you, I've only read one at this point, but I've talked to people who are very enthusiastic about the series. Our buddy Randall over at the Spy Guys and Gals blog is very bullish on the series as well. He likes it, and that guy is the final word to me on all books in the espionage genre.
I mean, when you talk about film adaptations, why Malko?
I don't know. Well, I mean, again, right now, Hollywood is gearing everything toward international sales. Really, China is kind of where it's at, but I don't know if these books were ever translated into that. So now we have this series, which went 200 installments, which was a huge hit internationally, came out in French, but I suspect it was translated in another language. Hollywood's looking for books and characters with global appeal right now. And I don't know, maybe Fassbender was a fan. I don't know what the thought process is behind any adaptation of any book. I mean, why the hell hasn't Mac Bolan been adapted at this point? Why the hell haven't they made a decent Matt Helms series instead of those stupid Dean Martin books? You'll drive yourself crazy trying to figure out any kind of logic behind Hollywood's business decisions.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we'll never figure it out tonight, but look for Malko #1 review on paperbackwarrior.com this week, along with Duel in the Snow, and we've got 5 reviews total this week on the website. You've got Richard Deming novel that we've got reviewed, and a pretty fun post-apocalyptic 80s novel. We're not going to spoil it for you here, but look for those this week on the website. And I guess that's it for now. We're looking forward to another episode next week. We've got some fun stuff lined up over the next few weeks. Until then, thanks for listening.
Goodbye, and remember, if you don't buy it, I will.
Thanks.